Americans have been so scared of nuclear energy. Jane Fonda and the China syndrome scared everyone half to death. But France gets 80% of its power from the atom, and France is able to handle the nuclear waste problem. And drilling in Anwar seems like a no-brainer. Wouldn't it reduce our dependence on foreign oil? Well, no, actually. This is Jerry Taylor of the Cato Institute. He says nuclear isn't so great either. You call this Republican junk science.
Well, not so much junk science as junk economics. I mean, if nuclear power made economic sense, we wouldn't need to subsidize it. We wouldn't need to guarantee loans to build those power plants. The fact is, if you take a Republican speech about nuclear power, cross out the word phrase nuclear power, and put in solar power, you've got a Democratic speech about energy. It's the same thing. What I think is we need to leave these to the markets. And in the marketplace, investors will not spend a single red dime on nuclear power because it's too expensive. It's a lot more expensive than coal-fired power. It's more expensive than gas-fired power. It's not Jane Fonda or Greenpeace that kill nuclear power. It's Wall Street investment banks who've looked at the bottom line and
said,
no.
I assume it's expensive only because of Jane Fonda and Greenpeace delaying it, all the regulatory process.
Well, we hear some of that, but I've seen no evidence for that effect. If you look abroad in liberal market economies that build nuclear power, you see the exact same things there that you see here, even in pro-nuclear power regimes, you know, regulatory architectures that are more friendly to nuclear power. You still see cost overruns. You still see expensive plants. You still see bankruptcies. You see all of those problems. You don't see them so much in France or China because these are places where investors don't decide what gets built. The government decide what gets built, and it's very hard to tangle out the numbers. But if you look in countries which are very much more pro-nuclear, like Japan or South Korea or countries like that, or Finland today, which is trying to build a nuclear power plant, and they're 50% over budget, they're 2 years behind schedule, and the same things are happening there as happened here in the 1970s.
So investors are saying, we won't invest unless you guarantee our loan.
Right. In 2007, there was a letter from the 6 largest investment banks on Wall Street, Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley and others. And it was a letter to the Department of Energy saying, look, you have this loan guarantee program to guarantee 80% of the loans we make to the nuclear power industry. That's not enough. We need a 100% guarantee, unconditional, before we give them a red cent. Now, to me, that's a market verdict that you're supposed to respect in this country. If market actors decide it's not a good investment in nuclear power, then we should respect that, just as if they decide that solar is not a particularly good investment or something else. We should leave these to investors and not bureaucrats.
Well, we just watched President Obama promising $8 billion of our money for these kind of subsidies. Don't the other forms of energy get monster subsidies too?
They do, but nuclear gets a lot. The industry itself would tell you that without loan guarantees, without liability protections in the form of the Price-Anderson Act, without production tax credits, nuclear power would disappear in this country.
So natural gas and coal are just much cheaper.
Absolutely. That's why we build gas-fired power plants. Over the last 20 years, virtually all the power plants we've built in this country have been gas-fired. Gas prices are on the decline right now. There's no particular reason to think that we can't produce enough gas for electricity. We've been doing it for quite some time. We should just go ahead and let investors have their say.
The second myth, drilling offshore. Makes sense to me.
Makes sense to me, too, but I think that there are good arguments for it and bad arguments for it. A bad argument for it is the idea that if we drill in the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge or the Gulf of Mexico, where currently it's off limits to the industry, that we can reduce gasoline prices significantly. Now, the reality is based on what we think is out there, according to the U.S. Geological Survey, we might be able to get about 1 million barrels of crude oil a day out of the Gulf and out of Alaska when the fields are mature. That's 1 million barrels of new supply in a world that is producing about 88 million barrels a day. In other words, that's only a little bit more than 1% increase in supply. Over the long haul, that implies a little more than about a 1% decrease in price. So the argument that if we were to just get rid of Greenpeace and get rid of the Department of Energy and let the oil industry go where it wants, we could see a major reduction in price, I don't think that's true. That's not a good argument for not drilling, however. A better argument is that, well, that crude oil is worth about $2 trillion. If the federal government is right about how much is there, that's $2 trillion of wealth that we could produce for the economy.
Grab it.
Absolutely. But that's the better argument.
The other bad argument, I think you would say, is that it's going to reduce our dependence on those evil dictators.
Well, we consume about 15 million barrels of crude oil a day. We produce 5. You know, so how are we going to even those numbers up? Even with Anwar and the Gulf of Mexico in play.
With Anwar and the Gulf of Mexico, we'd go from 5 to 6.
Right. So we wouldn't do it. And even if we could, it wouldn't make much sense. In other words, if we were energy independent, would that protect us from supply disruptions abroad? The answer is no. If there's a supply disruption in Saudi Arabia, then crude oil everywhere in the world is going to become more expensive in time. That's why Great Britain, which is largely energy independent, doesn't have prices lower than the global average. They pay the same price as we do for crude oil in wholesale markets, because it doesn't matter where the crude oil is from. These are global supply and demand curves that matter.
What about the Democrats' claim that windmill, solar power, it just feels good, it's no fossil fuels, that will make a big dent?
Well, the problem with renewable energy is it's the technology of the 12th century. I mean, we relied on solar and wind power before the Industrial Revolution, and the reason we moved away from those sources of energy is that these are highly dispersed forms of energy, needs a lot of land, it's very expensive to harness that energy, and it's very hard to store that energy and get it to where consumers are. Where the wind blows strongest and the sun shines brightest are places where people generally don't tend to live. That's why T. Boone Pickens, when he talks about his plans for wind power, wants the federal government to pony up hundreds of billions of dollars to build wires for him, to get that power from the windmill to the consumer. And that's something, in my opinion, the wind industry ought to pay for itself.
And if we did that, what % difference would it make?
Well, it's hard to say. If you were to pave the country with windmills, you can get a lot of power from wind, but it's a variable source of energy. It's not, the wind doesn't always blow when you need it. Most of the wind power we get in this country comes during the winter, not during the summer, and during night, not during day, and during low pressure periods, all the times we don't need the electricity. On hot summer days where you really need the electricity, the wind generally doesn't blow. And so it's not a very good source of energy for meeting peak
But give me a
demand.
%. Even if it worked well, we talking 50% of our electricity? Possibly?
Depends what your assumptions are. If you want to pave the country with windmills, you can get a lot of it, but it doesn't mean you can get it when you need it or where you need it.
Thank you, Jerry Taylor of the Cato Institute. So, what do you think? Jerry Taylor of the Cato Institute says nuclear power is impractical. It's like wind power for Republicans. Questions from you in the audience. Who would like to go first? Yes, sir, in the front.
I have a question for Jerry. I tend to agree with you about the third-generation nuclear power, but what about fourth-generation nuclear power, like liquid fluoride thorium reactors? Aren't they far more economical?
If they are, then the market will produce them, and investors will put their own money on the spot to get them built. The government won't have to lift a finger. We've been hearing about next-generation nuclear power for a long time. We still haven't seen it adopted effectively in the marketplace. But if and when it's economic and competitive, it'll happen endogenously. The government won't need a policy to secure it.
Question for Jerry. You mentioned the fact that the nuclear industry is comfortable with their regulators as evidence that that's not the problem that's making that energy source uneconomical. But aren't all large industries comfortable with their regulators because they keep out competition and then they can abstract subsidies on the back end to pay themselves? I mean, how is that evidence in this particular case that the regulatory system isn't a problem?
No, the regulatory system might very well be a problem. I do know people in the industry who tell me privately, look, the industry is like an inmate in a prison. What are they going to do, complain about the guards and the warden? I mean, they have to work in Washington, and it won't do them any good to complain about what Washington is doing to them. So it could very well be that the reality is something different from what the trade association is alleging. So that's very possibly true, and it's certainly true that big companies tend to like lots of regulation because it helps cartelize the industry. But if you ask the question, how do they benefit from these excessively costly regulations? I don't know how. Nobody's ordering nuclear power plants because of the cost. We haven't ordered one in over 30 years. If it weren't for the loan guarantees, there'd be no action going on at the present. So I'm not sure how they're benefited.
Thank you, Jerry Taylor.